our seminar series this term, and to a different group, we get a different group every time. I'm always surprised who's going to turn up. Very kindly, Gillian's come all this way north, although I know you've got another purpose for the journey, so you've made extra good use of it. But thank you nonetheless for coming to speak to us. And you're speaking on science, religion and healing, cancer.
Yeah.
Yes. Gillian.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris, for this invitation to come and speak. It's an honour to speak at Durham University, being such a centre for these matters. And thank you to Harry for sorting out all the logistics as well. So I feel I know you really well. All the emails we've exchanged was great. I'd like to present my research this afternoon, which melds together several areas of thought that I'm passionate about: religion, science, and medicine. I'm a practicing Christian. I'm ordained priest as well. I've come in disguise today. My doctoral research was in experimental atmospheric physics. Between my degree and my PhD, I had cancer of the lymphatic system. I'm now in remission. My day job is running the Guild of Health in St. Raphael, which is a national organisation which promotes the healing ministry of the Christian Church, doing helping parishes on the ground, but also running conferences and working with healthcare professionals. And part of my work in the Guild is, I believe, a need to take very seriously what science says about the world and about the body. So what I'm presenting is very professional, but is also very personal too. And I hope I stay the right side of rigorous and peer-reviewed, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Because in matters of faith and indeed matters of health, that line, I think, can be fuzzy. And I will also argue in this paper that personal involvement with the subject is not something that should be remote to science either. So the interaction of religion and science is a key area of human thought, and at its best brings together two incredibly important magisteria, which have defined history since the Greek philosophical schools at least: our desire to understand heaven and earth, faith and fact, the how with the why. And each generation, of course, have had its own expression of this conversation. The Greeks had a predominantly harmonious one between what they understood about the world and what they understood about the metaphysical. In the Reformation, biblical authority and interpretation set the boundaries of that conversation between religion and science. And in our own day, the conversation between religion and science has been influenced both by secularism and by the conflict thesis, which says the two should always be in opposition to one another. In this paper, I want to join in that conversation of between religion and science, but with a back-to-basics approach and a focus in a new area for this field: the human experience of illness as a legitimate place of conversation between science and religion. Why back to basics? Why? Sounds a bit new labour, doesn't it? It's back to basics because suffering is a universal human experience. This is a chance, this type of engagement is a chance for religion and science to get out of the academy. It's also an experience which is at the heart of why many people turn to God. It's a key theological area and a motivation for science, now in modern medicine and in engineering, but also if we go back to the root of what science was, and the Greek concept, the inception of science itself, understanding why things change. So my question for this paper is: what is the epistemological value of the human experience of suffering? What can we learn when suffering is studied? And I'm taking as a special example cancer. So by structure, I'm going to I want to say a little bit about human experience in current thinking of science and religion to situate this work. I'll talk a little bit about why I want to talk about cancer and the suffering it produces. Then look at that suffering from two different angles. First, questioning the taboo of cancer by looking at oncological science, by looking at the genetics of the disease. And when I say looking at it, doing a theological interpretation, theological hermeneutic based on Paul Ricoeur, so existential theology. That's the first way. The second way is then using what we learn in that first way, learn in that for healing, picking up on narrative medicine, what we learn by looking at the science and how that can help us tell a story in medicine, narrative medicine and recent work from psychiatry. And to give my conclusions at this point, so you know where I'm going, is that there is epistemological value in this. It's real. And the search for whatever knowledge can be found in doing this leads to real healing. So that by understanding the suffering produced, real healing can happen. And in this way, that matters in people's lives. At least that's my experience anyway. So in the last 50 years or so, in the academic world of science and religion, a lot has been achieved. And speaking of last year was the 50th anniversary of the Zygon, the big European journal of science and religion. There's been a lot of reflection about what we've achieved, where are we now, what the future might look like. And it might surprise you, there's some ambivalence about science and religion. Much has been achieved, particularly in doctrine of creation area, divine action, and what we love to talk about all the time is the relationship between science and religion. But there remains much that is unsolved, and other areas of interest that have never been addressed. Wilhelm Dries, who's the editor of Zygon, has warned of the dangers of failing to engage both with academic peers in a cross-disciplinary way and with ordinary people on the ground outside of the academy. Science religion remains niche, and there's a danger that we fixate on method and over-defining ourselves around areas such as quantum mechanics and evolutionary biology as the only science we're really interested in. And also a particular type of very cerebral Christianity. Typically is all gets talked about at science and religion conferences. Michael Fuller, who's a science religion person at Edinburgh University, responding to Peter Harrison's recent work, The Territories of Science and Religion, which were his Gifford lectures, critiquing them, Fuller wrote of several new areas of engagements for this field. In one of these, he notes that there's been new success for the ecumenical movement when it moved away from detailed work over joint theological statements and began to focus on working together over common issues. I'm sure if you're involved with the church at all, you might have had experience of this over the last few years. So churches coming together to look at poverty or homelessness or whatever it is. Fuller wonders whether this might be possible in science and religion. If science and religion could find a shared focus, an interest of both science and an interest of both religion, whether a focus on a practical issue might bear fruit. And it's from this launch point that I situate my work on cancer. I would also like to join it with the apparent ascent of the place of the human experience in epistemology. And there seem to be many places where it's creeping in. Just to mention two, the first one is philosophy. The philosopher Fiona Ellis, who's based at Heathrow, has recently written about an expansive naturalism. She writes this against a more restrictive scientific naturalism, which has defined the main orientation of contemporary Anglo-American philosophy over the last few decades. She suggests, rather than being dazzled by the power of science to explain, leaving one in a rather dubious position when it comes to things like love. Ellis suggests that the starting blocks for a more expansive naturalism, which may include God, should begin, and I quote, in the ambiguities of human experience. That's an analytical philosopher saying, look, let's take our human experience seriously, our experience of the world, and come up with ideas of how knowledge is formed from that. And that's new. The other place that human experience is creeping in is science itself. And it's there, particularly in studies of human consciousness, and in some subjects such as quantum mechanics, where human experience seems to be part of how the physical universe is understood. But at a more basic level, I want to highlight a sea change in how science understands itself and its own methodology. The Enlightenment has been commonly understood to have stripped out the personal engagement of science from science, but this has been critiqued famously by Michael Polanyi, who emphasised the ongoing personal participation of the scientific practitioner in the generation of knowledge. Polanyi wrote, we know more than we think. This idea that we've got a sort of inborn feeling and that we shouldn't ignore when doing science. But further, some argue that theologically, it's in the knowing about the world that we can glimpse the mind of Christ, building on the work of Polanyi and the idea of personal nature of scientific knowledge. The American theologian James Loder writes that the ultimate meaning of scientific knowledge relates to self-involvement with the knower. So what follows, I'm presenting a practical outworking of Loder's idea that the personal involvement of the sufferer with the science of cancer can find theological knowledge that is of value. I'm bringing together two fields around the practical project of understanding cancer suffering, a joint project, as Fuller has suggested, might bear fruit. I hope to take the ambiguities of human experience seriously in an extended theological reflection on science. So why cancer? There's a number of motivations for this. First, it's the disease I had, so I know a bit about it personally. I had lymphatic cancer diagnosed in 2000 and treated with chemotherapy. So I'm declaring an interest in the subject, and it's important when doing any kind of practical theology to be aware of your biases. I'm not neutral, but there's a potential that if you acknowledge it, you can try to avoid your bias. Secondly, of course, cancer is incredibly prevalent. 1 in 2 people will develop cancer during their life. Yet despite it being so common and survival rates increasing, it's a disease that provokes a degree of fear and loneliness that the statistics don't suggest, the statistics of survival don't suggest it should invoke. Surviving cancer is not the same as a broken leg getting better. Why is that? Well, cancer produces a plethora of suffering, physical, of course, often through the treatment, if not the disease itself, but also psychological and spiritual and social suffering. A growth affects the identity and control we think we have over our bodies. Cancer comes from within. It's almost like the body turning against itself. The treatment is tough, destroying autonomy, and sometimes changing one's physical appearance. The scans, drugs, needles, radiation, surgery, they all weaken the boundaries of our bodies. Bodies that we do other lovely things with suddenly belong somewhere else and are trampled all over. Cancer is subject to an unusual level of taboo. People are often uncomfortable even saying the C word. They'll grope around for tumor, lump, you know. And doctors have said to me they would rather give a diagnosis of heart disease, which are more likely to die from, to be quite frank, than cancer. Such is the weight of the word. People avoid the ill, not knowing what to say, so that's the social suffering. Cancer is a word, a diagnosis that comes with heavy moral undertones, rather than a disease which is really about uncontrolled cell division. Many ask, either out loud or to themselves, what did I do to deserve it? Cancer is a loaded word, one which is encumbered with metaphor, as Susan Sontag said. The cancer mythology is heavily dualistic, and the common rhetorical response is to use the war metaphor. How often do we say or hear that someone has lost their battle to cancer or is fighting hard? This suggests that by sheer force of will alone, the cellular multiplication can be conquered. The corollary, of course, is if you die from cancer, it's because you haven't tried hard enough. You know, it is hard to not say fight hard. You know, it is hard to find other language, and I struggle with that. But the corollary is that it might inflict people with guilt. Cancer is not simply a terrible disease, but a potentially heavy label which carries a great weight, and its theological burdens cannot be ignored. A Christian with the illness might ponder whether she really is fearfully and wonderfully made, as the psalmist sings, and created in the image of God, as the doctrine of creation suggests. Given the situation produced by cancer, my key question for a theological reflection is this: can a theological reflection on the science of cancer offer alternative metaphors to the war metaphor and reduce suffering that a war metaphor might cause. So my method of theological reflection, as I mentioned, is focused on the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who was born in 1913 and died in 2005. He's best known for his work on hermeneutics. He trained in the phenomenological tradition of continental philosophy, but also noted for his interdisciplinary work. He's also noted for being very, very complicated, changing things as he goes along and being rather hard to follow, which is actually perfect if you want to use it. So I'm sure, as you all know, hermeneutics is the art of interpretation, particularly interpretation that leads to understanding. Ricoeur would argue that hermeneutics is a factor in any sort of inquiry and at the root of how we gain all knowledge, including self-knowledge. Interpretation is not just about a way of knowing, it's not just gathering information for Ricoeur, but for him it's about how the knowing affects the being in the world. For Ricoeur, interdisciplinary interpretation, so going between fields, is about finding bridges across or shrinking the distance between the interpreter and what they want to interpret, in a process which is, as I said, less about storing up information and more about growth by appropriation. Ricoeur would write that this is a struggle, difficult thing to do, but a worthwhile one because we seek to bring home the alien by appropriation across normal boundaries, and in that way gain knowledge and deepen self-understanding. Now recently scholars have been returning to Ricoeur his method in the interpretation of science. His methods are hard to define due to his productivity and diversity, but some studies have shown it's possible to draw out themes and motives. And I found a recent book, 2013, Kenneth A. Reinhot, I'm not quite sure how you say his name, Reinhot, who's done this. He's written a method of how to use Ricoeur to interpret science. His method of interdisciplinary inquiry in the following statement. He writes, interdisciplinary interpretation is a dialectical process of understanding through explanation. The dialectical process of understanding through explanation. So it's a bit like, and that sounds fancy, but it's a bit like you read a book, one of those books that changes how you think about the entire world. You haven't just read it, you've interpreted it such that it somehow has changed who you are, or has changed who you are in that, so that you look at the world in a different way. And we can all think about books that have done that to us. And of course the Gospels as well. If you're a practicing Christian in some way, the Gospels have changed your life such that you now interpret the world in a different way. So that's all that statement is saying. So as theologians, we're quite used to that type of process. Applying it to science might be something that's new. So let's go back to the phrase and break it down a little. It's a dialectical process of understanding through explanation. The dialectic usually suggests two entities with different points of view engaging with one another to try and find out the truth. The dialectic here is between understanding and explanation. So understanding is more interpretative, explanation is the facts and figures. So in this case, I'm asking the question whether self-understanding can be changed through interpreting the explanation, which is science. So can I take my what I know about myself, what I believe, my experience, and then examine oncological genetics, the science of cancer, to see if I can somehow ask what it means for me, which is what Ricoeur would have asked. What does this mean for me? And can that change my self-understanding? In the Ricoeurian methodology, as suggested by Reinhart, the interpretation of the science is done through theological reflection, and this requires self-awareness and honesty. And to the end, in this kind of process, I make the following caveats. The science of cancer is examined, acknowledging that I'm not a cancer specialist. I don't never study cancer at a degree level, but it's in the nature of the interdisciplinary work that one is often not an expert in one half of the conversation, but we have the ability to learn. I acknowledge my own framework and pre-existing understandings. I'm a Christian priest, a cancer survivor, and a member of the faith community. I have predisposed ways of thinking about God, thinking about suffering and creation. However, I aim to judge my interpretations and accept the possibility in the process that I might change those ideas. My theology might be changed by doing this. So I've just got to be open to that if I'm going to do this properly. It's a subjective process. I acknowledge that multiple meanings are possible. Chris might do the same thing to me and come up with a whole different, interpretation. My results may not have universal application. But in this process, I'm committed to working out the meaning of the science for me. I bring it to the interpretation certain key theological ideas, namely that I'm made in the image of God, wonderfully and fearfully. That's what I'm taking to this. And I aim not to find new meaning in this text or the science, or to project my own meaning, but to discover a new type of being in the world as a result of this process. So the first step is to do a bit of science. So I don't know why my right hand's holding all this number. Right, so there we are. What's in my right hand? The science of cancer. Cancer is shockingly ingenious. The 10,000 billion or so cells in the human body all work together in harmony, delicately observing one another, sending and receiving conflict signals to work as one. All cancer needs is one cell that decides to do its own thing without consideration of the greater organism. This type of self-interested biochemistry is a surprisingly unlikely event, given all the cell division that goes on in the human body over its lifetime. But when it does happen, when one cell begins rapid and uncontrollable multiplication, the eventual effect is death to the whole body. The roots of this lie in the blueprint of the cell, the genetic information that regulates how cells divide. The key lies with Proto-Oncogenes, part of the cell's genetic code linked to reproduction and susceptible to becoming oncogenes through mutations of the code. These oncogenes are the cancer genes, if you like, and are responsible for cancer-like cell division. The body's got loads of different self-defense mechanisms to protect against cancerous growth. One of them are tumor suppressor genes, which act as checks and balances to the system to stop runaway growth. However, cancer can inactivate these. It's got lots of other ways to circumnavigate the body's defense system. It may meddle with growth signaling proteins to trick a cell into multiplying, using its own highly developed systems to bring about its own downfall. It can also undermine the cell's natural clock. A cell will only reproduce itself so many times until it reaches a stop, and it stops doing that. Cancer gets out of that, will recreate the DNA strand, so it will never stop doing that. And it can also circumnavigate the cell's suicide program, called cell apoptosis, which it normally will activate if the cell receives irregularities in its own growth regulating circuitry and in the event of a cancer cell. It seems like a fail-safe security system, but this too cancer can wheedle out of, cleverly circumnavigating all the different ways that our bodies are designed to stop it. Now that's what happens once cancer appears in the body. Why does it appear in the body in the first place? And this is a contentious area of cancer research. Cancer appearing in the body is linked to hereditary factors, environmental links, but also randomness, sheer bad luck. Although I should put that bad luck in here. So environmental, hereditary, or just serendipity. And different cancer researchers will tell you one has got priority over the other, and it depends on the cancer as well. Some are much more linked to hereditary factors, other ones are random as well. So that's the science. This is what my right hand's holding. That is a very brief, very sketchy layperson's understanding of cancer genetics. But it's certainly enough, I think, to have a theological reflection about. So what Ricoeur would say, what does this mean for me? What happens when I take the explanation and put it into conversation with my theology, what I believe? What emerges when oncological genetics meets my faith and that belief that I'm uniquely created and loved by God? How does that work? So these are my outcomes. I've got 4. The first is that the science of cancer, once it appears in the body, for example, getting around all those systems designed to stop it, does ratify some of the aspects of the war metaphor. It does feel like a battle, actually, when I looked at the science. The cancer cells cleverly undermining the cell's own defense mechanism seems to be something like a battle of wits. The second one, the science of the origin of cancer, whether it's caused by bad luck, randomness, hereditary nature, or environmental factors, disabuses any notion that cancer is a moral judgment or any kind of personal attack on the body. The random nature of cancer emphasizes that this is not a disease given out in judgment. Luckily for theology, the idea that we're created in the image of God is not affected by my theological interpretation of science. Okay, in its origin, it's not an attack, and it's not personal, it's just biochemistry. Third conclusion, although it can be metaphorically seen as a battle to be fought once cancer is diagnosed, it's not a battle against sin or evil or a baddie, but rather a battle of biochemistry in nature. Cancer remains the enemy because it kills. Don't want to get around that. It's not good, but its origins are not in sin, badness, or evil, which are the root of that war metaphor, I feel. My fourth conclusion is science shows that at its roots is cellular dysfunction, not some external force. So my interpretation leads me away to dualistic understandings of the disease. All these outcomes allow me to preserve my theological self-understanding as wonderfully made in the image of God. Good luck. The theological detour into oncological science does not require me to adjust the doctrine of creation for me. So that's all good. But this work suggests that we do need revised metaphors for cancer, metaphors which are able to encapsulate its origins. I did some qualitative research amongst different people who've been affected by cancer, people who've had cancer, their friends and families, but also doctors and people who work pastorally with the ill. And I asked them lots of questions about that metaphor that we use for cancer and the language we would use around the disease. And that produced some really interesting results. I asked them to think about I asked them what they thought about cancer. All different parts of the group. I asked them to choose from the following statements. Cancer is an enemy within my body, something that's gone wrong with my body, part of my body, or none of the above. Universally, family and friends of the ill chose the statement, an enemy within my body, within the body. So those who are looking at their loved ones see it as an enemy. However, all medical professionals and people who'd had cancer described it as something that's gone wrong with my body. There's a difference. And it'd be really useful to do more research into that and to explore the extent to which friends and family of the ill personify the disease and the degree to which people with the disease do not. New metaphors, therefore, I suggest must dispel dualistic attitudes of the disease, which can promote isolation from one's own body. If you've got something inside that's killing you, it can become quite dualistic and lonely. Rowan Williams, writing a commentary on the healing miracles in St. Mark's Gospel, points out that the miracles are not only about physical healing, but rather they focus on restoration and reconnection. For example, when the leper is healed, he goes and rejoins his community from which he'd been excluded. And that was part of the healing. As well as the medical healing, there was a social aspect to it. In cancer, healing is needed not only physically, but psychologically and socially. And reconciliation needs to be found between the self and the body, which appears to be killing itself through uncontrolled cell division, driven on really by the same force that is part of all healthy cell division. It's the same force, just uncontrolled. A new metaphorical relationship to the experience of cancer is needed, one that resonates with both the science of cancer and the theological conviction that we are made in the image of God. Metaphors are needed that open doors of hope and prevent the polarizing fear and paranoia that everything, including one's own body, is out to get you. Other metaphors that I've thought of and other people have suggested is a tree with a bit of a disease, or a dance with many people, or a journey. And for me, I used the metaphor of a pilgrimage, a journey with the potential of learning about ourselves and learning about God. These are personal, and it would be interesting to extend the work, and people also who are involved with pastoral ministry, how we can use images and metaphors to help people find, help people really get control over what's happening to them by finding a language that's appropriate. So just finally, I just want to say a little bit about storytelling. The next step is using these new metaphorical understandings and extending the suggestion of Williams that healing is about reconnection. And here, picking up on recent work done in psychiatric healing, narrative medicine, and the power of storytelling in healing. Narrative has been shown to be important in medicine in diagnosing and caring for patients in a holistic, patient-centered approach to clinical problems. It gives the patient a voice and a way to interact with their healthcare, and for the clinicians to get the whole picture and thus tailor treatment accordingly. But it's more than that, I think. Narrative is seen in a broader way to be at the heart of how we construct our own identity and a key part of our spiritual self-understanding, which includes the process of interpretation, whether that's interpretations of texts, of tradition, of worship, of theology and experience, using all these different ways of interpretation in the pursuit of meaning and purpose. I think cancer, from my own experience particularly, is an event that requires interpretation. Some survivors develop post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of both the diagnosis and often the treatment, both separate, related but separate traumatic experiences. And that can form into quite serious mental health problems. But studies have shown that some recover well and produce what they call post-traumatic growth, PTG, that in some people healing wasn't just about getting better, but their mental health, their spiritual health, and their self-understanding was accelerated as a result of some kind of healing, which they associated with being able to narrate what had happened to them, that they were able to tell their story and somehow found healing through that. Arthur Frank wrote about illness narratives in his book, and he gave 3 different types of stories that people tell when they've been ill. The first one is the restitution narrative, sort of the victory parade. And this is really a very familiar one. It's sort of the Lance Armstrong of cancer stories. I mean, before he was a drugs cheat, recycling. He actually wrote a great book about cancer survival. And it was, and his story was, he had a very bad testicular cancer. You know, I'm gonna be this, and I'm gonna be a world champion. And that was his thing, and it got him through. And you know what, he was world champion. But that's part of a much more widespread story. That okay, for a cancer person, I've had cancer, but I've got better. It's made me stronger, better. And every sunset's amazing now, you know, and life's just perfect because I've had this thing. You know that song, "What doesn't kill you make you stronger"? That's a restitution narrative for cancer. It's a culturally preferred narrative. It's a story people want to tell. Sorry, it's a story people want to hear when it comes to cancer. They want to hear that you've got better and everything's fine. They also want to hear that medicine has the power to heal. And that the professionals have the power to make it better. That's part of the restitution narrative. In the restitution narrative, there's no space for the chronically ill or the terminally ill. I found that a very limiting narrative, one that I couldn't fit into. The second type of narrative, Frank suggests, comes out of illness as a chaos narrative, where nothing makes sense. You know, I had cancer, it was awful, I don't know why it happened, and I can no longer make sense of everything. And these are hard stories. These are hard stories to hear, actually, because you can't make them better. But they're probably honest stories of trauma and anger about why this has happened. But he suggests a third type of story, the quest narrative. In the quest narrative, illness is seen as a journey, and the ill get to tell their story. The experience of suffering is taken seriously, but is not allowed to have the final word. The person adopting the quest narrative neither lets a cancer be ignored, nor allows it to overcome their story. In the quest narrative, a new identity is sought in light of the experience. The meaning and the healing is found in the story, which I suggest can benefit from the inclusion of science and its interpretation. And I think that because this is a journey I've been on, I think, journey of finding healing by taking the science seriously and by taking my story seriously as well. Before I was ordained, I went back to the chemotherapy ward after 12 years of remission. I went and met my nurse, and we went for coffee, and I touched my own experience, expecting it to be chaotic and devastating, but actually finding it really healing. So I went through all this, and I read Arthur Frank, and wondered, oh yes, of course, it's quest narrative. Which I always feel should include more dragons if you have a quest. And part of that, an important part of that is finding the right language to tell the quest narrative in, and not to be inflicted by what society expects you to say about your experience, but the freedom to express yourself and use your own metaphors. Interestingly, I did this work with my church warden, my husband's church warden, who was going through breast cancer at the time. Asked her to come up with metaphors and what she felt, and she liked the journey metaphor. And she was on Facebook, and every few days she posted a new picture of a path or a road, which I knew was reflecting her journey. She had a hard time. She put out a picture of somebody trekking through the snow, or a particularly rocky path, or she found a picture of a path next to a bench to rest on. For her, she could sit on the bench with other people who were travelling along, and this became a really powerful thing for her, to take control of what is a destabilizing experience and a frightening experience. And also such a useful, I found, way to find healing after the event, because cancer of course doesn't stop when you go into remission. You enter a different phase, which is about uncertainty as well, and the quest can continue to find meaning and identity with often frightening uncertainty. So just to conclude, in this paper I considered the epistemological value in the human experience of suffering with cancer, a common disease with marked social and psychological difficulties and subject to taboo. I've argued that when the science is subject to theological interpretation, then new metaphorical relationships with the disease are possible. Narrative medicine promotes the value of storytelling and healing. As a narrative-based faith, theological interpretation of a story is an expected part of the epistemology. To this end, I suggest that the quest narrative, a journey to seek meaning in the experience, which may include connection with the science, is a positive step. But what is this positive step towards? What is the epistemological value of the study when it's taken out of the academy? First, for me, it's all about connection. Connection to the science, connection to experience, to my theological tradition, and a recovery of self-identity, and indeed construction of identity in remission. As a theist, it's also about connection to God. As part of the science and religion conversation, it's a back-to-basics approach because it gives back-to-basic results. Both science and religion have the same goal, human flourishing. The epistemological value of examining suffering in an interpretive process involving science and religion is that it elevates the sufferer, connects them into what is happening and who they are, and it leads to healing in a true and a broad sense. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.